So welcome to the talk about Zero Trust or elevating security with Zero Trust architectures. Let's start with a short introduction. My name is Daniel Pötzinger. I'm CTO at AOE. AOE is a software development company. We are helping different companies in their digitalization. And a huge part of that is, of course, cloud operation and DevOps. Yeah, with me, my colleague Dominik. We had to rearrange because it was really hard to come to Munich. So nice that you managed to come to Munich and to the session.
Yeah, I'm Dominik. I'm working for AOE as a senior DevOps consultant.
Good. Before we start, maybe we can do a short check in the room. How many of you are familiar with Zero Trust principles and Zero Trust architectures? So just like, okay, it's about, I think, 20% or so. The second question would have been like, in your company, would you say you're doing quite good in implementing Zero Trust architectures? So raise your, okay, good. So we have like, a few people are familiar with the principles, and nobody was keen enough saying, "Okay, we are doing good." So yeah, so I hope you we have something in the talk that helps you argumenting why it is important and some hints where to get started. Bist du?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there was a huge hack in 2017. It was Equifax. It was a multinational customer credit reporting agency. So hackers have stolen 150 million customer data. This is almost, I would say, 20% of the citizens of America and British people, and that was a huge thing, and Equifax had to pay $700 million in compensation fees. So super expensive thing, but they had vulnerability issues in a framework called Apache SOC, and the hack would have been actually avoidable through updates there. Let's just click on.
Warte, du kannst. Warte. Hier, warte, klicken. Ja, und dann Zoom.
Okay. Cool. So a wide known vulnerability in Apache SOC, and a missing network segmentation, unencrypted personal credentials on the network was shared. They had unencrypted data in their database, and in the end, they had a broken intrusion detection. So every of that things would have been avoidable. So yeah, now we're talking about Zero Trust and how you can actually implement this with security by design already. So yeah, but Equifax was not the only one. So there have been a lot.
Yeah, so I think Equifax was one of the first major ones. But if you look at the news is full of data leaks and hacks that is discussed there, and ransomware attacks. And the feeling is that this is really increasing over time. And this is not only a feeling, it's proven by statistics. Here's one statistic that shows the amount of supply chain attacks. And this is really growing exponentially by over 700% per year. And this is not the only statistic that is shown in this direction. You find ransomware, or the amount of money paid for ransomware attacks, same direction, same exponential growth. You find the amount of data in general leaked. So everything is really showing in a very dangerous direction. And I think the reasons for this are multiple. One of this is, of course, we as a society are more and more digitalized, so there's just more to hack, of course. But there's a second reason to it, and I think it's very important to be aware of that. Hacking is a business model in itself. So there are a lot of organizations that really professionally try to hack and try to earn money with it, and they're earning money with it. And I think this is showing that every company really has an increased risk of being like attacked. And of course, it's increasing the investment that companies need to do in order to improve on security. So that is kind of the message of that slide. It's getting more and more, and you as a company are really kind of forced to react on it. So it's time to talk about security, and security is mainly based on trust. It's about trusting who has access to what resource. It's about trusting if someone is really the one who claims to be he is. So security is based on trust. And if we look back in a more like classical security models, the classical security model, the main thing was that trust was based on network parameter. Essentially meaning if you're in a company network, because they have physical access or you are dealt in via VPN, you're kind of considered to be in and you can access a lot of resources. And this is, of course, there has a high risk of breaches because of that basic model that once you're in, you're considered to be in. Also, that model has fallen out of time because everything is moving outside of the network parameters. You have remote work, you have more and more mobile devices, you have cloud services, so everything is moving out. So it's really time to think security new, and this is where zero trust and the zero trust security framework or security model kind of evolves. And this is what we are talking about. So zero trust. The basic principle is never trust, always verify. And there are some really key principles.
Strong identity verification is one of the keys of a zero trust architecture. So we need to verify that user or an identity is who it is claiming for. We are actually verifying access. You should start with a least privileges architecture where, and you just open things like that you need afterwards. And then it's also important to assume that every request that reaches your network should be assumed as a breach. So this is actually then zero trust.
Yeah, and if you're implementing it, you have a much more increased security and a much reduced risk in getting attacked and being successfully attacked. Also, it has a huge convenience and usability aspect because it allows to work from everywhere and to access resources from everywhere, for example. So it's more fitting to the today's work environment. And on this slide, we are wanting to give an overview of what like technical aspects are related to zero trust and zero trust architectures, and what organizational and like meta aspects are relevant. So this is really an overview slide that maybe also helps to navigate the complete topic. On the left side, you see the different technical aspects, and you can really view them as a kind of layered security approach. So every layer adds additional security barriers, and in case one fails, you still have others. Today, we want to zoom in into the topic of identity and identity awareness, and a bit more on application security and application architecture. And then there are this kind of meta topics, the topic how software is actually secured in the supply chain or in the delivery process. We talk a bit about that one. Of course, security, monitoring, automation is a company-wide overarching topic that is related to building zero trust environments. And the last one is, and you can also view this as the most essential one, all the organizational and cultural things that are involved into this. So this is kind of nice overview. And Coming back to this classical security model where we only have the network parameters, the company network, on this slide, we want to show the three, I would say, most important concepts that are introduced with zero trust architectures. On the one hand, it's introducing microsegmentation. So instead just having one barrier, the idea is that ideally around every application, around every resource, you have a microsegment and protect what's inside. And to access it, you always, ideally with every request, need to provide an identity proof. So you need to prove that you have the identity so that this inside this microsegment, it can be evaluated if you have access or not. And this identity is provided by an identity provider that is normally embedded in a complete IAM solution. So that is a crucial part of a zero trust architecture, some entity that gives the identity proof. And if you have this in place, you can, without losing security, also add cloud services to your complete architecture that's protected kind of the same way with the microsegment. So I think this slide shows the three most important concepts that are introduced in addition to the network parameter that are existing. Good. Before we start deep diving into identity, some more motivations to really dig more into this. Because you have seen it on the overview slide, there's a lot to consider. And it's definitely work to bring your complete company architecture to a complete zero trust architecture, but it's really worth it. To prove that, two slides with statistics. Our friends at Splunk have done a security survey among security teams. I think alone this limits the amount of organizations. I'm sure not every organization has dedicated security teams, but in that security teams, more than half of them really report that it's really hard to keep up with all the security requirements and that it's getting harder and harder. The next statistics goes in the same direction. Nearly 90% of them report that they have ongoing challenge with finding the right skills and talents that they would need to improve on that. So it's not easy, but it's worth it because, and this is another statistic, I think the last one for the slides, security leaders are the one considered to do pretty okay or pretty good in the zero trust principles and all the security aspects we are mentioning. Versus non-leaders. So security leaders are 4 times more efficient in blocking attacks and 4 times more efficient in detecting breaches and 3 times better in closing breaches once they are detected. So it's really a huge benefit that you can have in terms of security. Good.
Yeah. Now we are talking about identity and identity awareness, which was one of the main topics of the zero trust architecture. So it's really important that you always prove who or what is, or that the user has this identity claims for. We're also differentiating between auth N and auth Z, which would be auth N for authentication, auth Z for authorization. The first one is really to prove the identity of the user or of the device. It could be also a device, actually. And the second one is to check the rights or access rights to allow that request to pass. So that's a really important thing. And SSO is the key here. So that IAM solutions are always kind of bound or having that SSO endpoints that you can relatively easy integrate with. A typical IAM solution consists in SSO, an IAM solution where you can manage that identities, and an IDP which you can use to integrate relatively easy in your infrastructure. So that's yeah. With this setup, you usually have a seamless user experience. You have the centralized, or the identities centralized, meaning that you have some kind of like, a central place or place where the users are living, and only one place, so you're not having like users here and there. It's also auditable. You can use policy enforcements on passwords. And of course, there's also the ability to block identities that have been compromised or are, yeah, maybe bad actors. So, yeah, there are the big three solutions that most of you know, like Google IAM, AWS IAM Identity Center, which is the new offer of, I think it was former known as AWS SSO. So the Identity Center is, as far as I know, relatively new. And then we have the Azure Active Directory, which is just the cloud active Microsoft Active Directory that all you guys know. We also have some open source solutions that can be used. One of them is Keycloak, which is pretty well known and widely used. And another would be free IPA. And also cloud solutions like Okta, Ping Identity, and also Bear ID. Yeah, it's pretty important that your solution implements both or supports both protocols, so OIDC and SAML, to be able to also federate maybe to other identity providers that bring their own user base and have their own single source of truth for the user storage. Also very important is that you enable MFA. Could be one-time passwords or SMS or email verification. Also YubiKeys are widely used. And yeah, with all of that, a good IAM solution brings also the auditing capabilities. So you know when users have been logged or have logged in, and where the requests have flown to, and so on. And yeah, as I mentioned before, it's also a good idea to have like some kind of like a federation of that IAM solution where you can then bind maybe Azure Active Directory, where your company users live, binding them, for example, to the AWS Identity Center, so that your company employees can relatively simply log in into applications there. And one thing that we have learned from the past is don't expire passwords. So people tend to use the same patterns or mechanisms in their passwords. Usually if you have that passwords rotation enabled and you're enforcing that every 3 months, then employees are usually maybe changing some numbers at the end of the password, and that's not security, actually.
Who's doing this?
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, don't expire passwords. A better solution would definitely be the MFA. Yeah.
Which is also soon to be forced by some regulations for a lot of companies to really add multi-factor authentication.
Yeah. Yeah, you wonder how we can integrate that. Yeah, the answer, so you can see like the request chain top down. First we hit the load balancer, then an ingress, set up a kubeproxy to get to the nodes, and then you usually have a service mesh for advanced networking. A sidecar is then often used, and then at the end you reach the application. And to integrate with Zero Trust or with the IAM SSO solutions, yeah, I guess it's another proxy that you usually use. So yeah, so this proxy is actually then an identity-aware proxy. It's usually a layer 7, so an HTTP proxy that yeah, takes a request, checks the tokens that are usually as part of that request, verifies that the user or the identity can be verified, the token signature is valid, and so on. And yeah, finally then do an authorization on that request and then decide to let them through or not.
Good. To the next technical aspects, and we keep this as an overview. It's of course all the aspects about networking and firewalling. As said, the idea with zero trust architecture is to get more fine-grained so that you have multiple barriers to hack, and in case one fails, you still have another. So of course, network segmentation is still important, because traffic that is not allowed is not allowed. You don't have to take care of verifying or securing them anymore. But to be more fine-grained, the concept of software-defined network, of course, is helpful because you can, with the software configuration, adjust on a more fine-grained level your network policies, and Kubernetes works a lot with that. And then getting more smaller with the so-called microsegmentation, where ideally you have a segment or protection around every application, and there are more tools that support building or configuring microsegments around your application, like software-defined perimeters or service meshes that are included in Kubernetes. And especially the last one, thinking around barriers between applications, is also getting very important and interesting from a pure software architecture perspective. I think nowadays distributed architectures cannot be designed without having security in mind, and this is where we want to have a small deep dive now. It's really about how distributed architectures deal with access control, how to handle tokens. I think as a software developer and architect, it's crucial to have in mind. And we have an example to demonstrate some key concepts there. So imagine a distributed architecture where you have a self-care portal where the customer or the user wants to, for example, view contracts and some details. That self-care portal gets information from a contracting microservice or service. Then you have an invoicing service that also needs to have data from the contracts to generate invoices, for example. So I think you can imagine that distributed architecture. And of course, in a zero trust architecture somewhere, ideally close to the organizationally close to the application architecture, there is an IAM solution that takes care of all the things that Dominik just mentioned. Good, let's start with an example use case or scenario that I use to explain some of the key concepts. So the user wants to access a resource in the self-care portal. With the first request, the self-care portal doesn't know who he is, because he does not present any identity. So the self-care portal redirects the user to the IAM solution and says, please, IAM solution, authenticate the user, and then the user comes back. Technically, the nowadays the most used standard is OpenID Connect, and that's nothing too complex. You can read about the standard, and that slide shows the basic principles. So the authentication is totally happening in the scope or in the responsibility of the IAM solution or the identity provider. In this case, the new user needs to provide secrets, so username and password. And in response, the IAM solution returns an identity proof or representation of that authentication. It's a set of tokens. And also here, it's nothing magically. The tokens follow a standard. Most of them, it's a JOT token. And you can take the content of the token, pass it to the website, and see what's in it. The structure is that it has some header information, some payload with information like who is the user, who can read the tokens, and of course a signature, so that it can be proven that it's not no man in the middle, that it's really a valid signature. So this is happening as a key principle. And then the user represents or presents this token or this identity proof to the application, to the resource it wants to access, as said, ideally with every request. And then, very important, that microsegment or that application, of course, needs to validate the token. That's normally done by an identity-aware proxy or by a library that you use. So as a developer, you don't need to really take care of it, but I think it's still important to know what's going on. So the signatures, of course, checked. All the expiration dates are checked. The audience is checked, to mention the most important one. And if that is okay, if the validation is okay, then it's in the scope of the resource or the application to do the authorization. So to decide with the help of that information in the token, is the user allowed to do what he wants to do? And there are different concepts for it. In this case, a very typical role-based access control is done. So in one of the payload claims in the token, there's just the name of the role, and the self-care portal can decide if that role has access to the resource he wants to do. There are like more sophisticated access controls, like attribute access control, or you can even outsource the policies with Open Policy Agent. So there's more to do there. But key message here is authorization is in the scope here, and every request is validated. On that slide, another concept that you probably know from banking application or others is explained, the so-called step-up authentication. So imagine that the user wants to access a really critical resource. I don't know, maybe changing or accessing payment data or some really sensitive information. Then the self-care portal can say, I want the identity proof. I really want to make sure that the level of assurance, that's how it is called, is high. So I really want to make sure that this user is the one that he supposed to be. In this case, the self-care portal triggers a so-called re-authentication within the IAM solution, saying I want a token that has a really high level of assurance. And then it's again scope of the IAM solution to decide how to give that identity proof. Typically, in this case, the IAM solution is configured so that the user needs to provide a second factor or even a third factor. And then same thing like before, the request can have a token that now has a higher level of assurance. So just want to show this concept of step-up authentication, which is, I think, a good compromise between usability for the user and security for the things that the user wants to do. Good. Next slide, other concept. It's very typical in distributed architecture that you pass tokens upstream. So the self-care portal needs also personal information from another upstream service, in this case, the contracting service, and it's presenting the same token it gets here to the contracting service. And then the contracting service, again, can decide based on on his authorization logic if he responds to the request or not. And last but not least, of course, you have service-to-service communication. The concept there is similar. The invoicing service, in order to access data from the contracting service, needs to provide tokens, needs to provide an identity proof. And there are, in the standard, there is this, technically it's called client credential grant. So there's, it works similar. The invoicing service requests a token in the IAM solution. So also here's an authentication process, and then it's basically the same before accessing data of a contracting service. The invoicing service needs to provide an identity proof. Questions? I think we have time. No? Good. So that was a small deep dive, how related zero trust architecture is with distributed architecture or software architecture in general. And I think there's one key takeaway. Whenever you build or deploy an application, deal with it as if it would be public. So don't rely on any network parameters or VPN or whatever before, because core principle of zero trust is assume breach. And if you consider your application like this, you're much more safe.
Yeah, now we're talking about infrastructure. So of course, for zero trust architecture is also pretty important to look into the infrastructure layer. Yeah, there are possibilities to have, there are important aspects from a security perspective, which are patch management, vulnerability management, and system hardening in general. Yeah.
I think the next aspects that we don't cover in detail is everything around secure data handling. And secure data handling starts with something non-technical. Of course, in your company, you need to define which information has which criticality, so information classification, like which information is really critical, which information is publical. So this is the scope of information security management. And from there on, you decide if it's how critical the information is that you store. And then technically you have a lot of options like encryption in rest, encryption in transit, which should be the default. But even something like encrypt on client side, which is technically more effort, but higher security. Or don't just rely on software algorithm. You can also use confidential computing to have even more security on the encryption side, just to give you an overview of that pillar.
Yeah. Another thing is you should also defend from supply chain attacks and verify that also your deployment and delivery pipelines are secure. So this takes in like security on Git operations. There should be a proper risk management, and you should also know how to deal with possible vulnerabilities that gets detected. So, and if we look from to a standard, I would say like delivery pipeline, you have first of all the commit that triggers actually the CI/CD pipeline. There you have the Git credentials where the user is authenticating. And then you have some static code analysis, dependency scanning. So for vulnerabilities, I would say like tools like Triffy or SNCC or others that can do container scanning for dependencies, but also OS side vulnerabilities. And in the whole chain, you also need to verify that your delivery pipelines are also in a way like authenticated. So a lot of the delivery pipeline, the nodes that are used should also be authenticated against clusters, against other services that it is using actually.
Also, also a very typical thing that is not widely adopted is how developers commit changes to the source code. I think, how many of you use GitLab? How many of you have connected GitLab to a single sign-on system? Okay, and then it seemed like, okay, I'm safe, but normally the way how you push commits is based on SSH or HTTP handshake or security mechanism, and this is not involving the single sign-on solution. So developers just have their Git SSH key, and if that identity is compromised, that key can still push source code. So that's something that, out of experience, and most of software development organizations have not changed, but it's easy to change. There's the, how's it called, GitLab?
Git credentials helper.
Yeah, where you can bind your SSH key to the SSO solution and you're much more secure. So I think that is an easy step to do, and it improves the beginning of your delivery pipeline.
Important thing is also that you usually should automate the whole process, so that you always make sure that you have all the things in place, like vulnerability scanning, intrusion detection, security events. You have some logs about it, to also have some tracing capabilities to and that's it, I would say.
Yeah, and then I think, the last meta aspect that is also relevant to consider in zero trust environments or architecture is, of course, the topic of organization and culture. And it starts, of course, with having a security conscious company culture. And that can be hard depending on the company. If security is just seen as something I must do, I think it's very hard to establish something like a security conscious culture. But it's very important because, as we have seen, the aspect of monitoring and everything we've shown really depends on the amount of collaboration between different units and different professions in the company. Also, topics like DevSecOps or shift left security, at the end, are concepts that try to change the culture and try to change communication structures. So this is very important, and changing culture is sometimes complex. It starts definitely also with the mandate that the leadership is giving to that topic. And tools or approaches around information security management kind of support to professionalize the way to culture shift, things like ISO or NIST, management frameworks that should help giving really that cultural shift. So it's an important topic to consider. Yeah, and if we look back to the Equifax hack, I think most of the things that have happening during the hack could have been avoided. We've put the mitigations that we've learned in the talk right to it. Yeah. Should we go in detail about? Or I think it's pretty self-explaining. With the proper with the proper detection in the CI/CD pipeline, of course, they would have detected that the build would have never gone to production with that broken library in the supply chain. Yeah, of course, it's everything about micro-segmentation. They didn't have any segmentation. Having unencrypted personal credentials, I think that's really a cultural thing. Should never happen. Yeah, and then you have other, like if they would have encryption addressed, even that would be the last protection layer. And having, I mean, they spent money for license for intrusion detection system, but they did not use it. So that's obviously showing that they are not good in observing their landscape and everything. Good. So we come to the summary. We've learned that there's a really dangerous trend. So hacks and breaches are really exploding because it's a business model, and it's more and more business critical for any company to improve security and reduce risk there. And zero trust and the zero trust principles and frameworks really help with that, to improve that. It's work, but it's worth it. Some hints about how to start the journey. Think big, so having really the big vision and picture together with the culture shift in mind, but start small and act now. I think that's a good claim. And a typical way to start is start with adding the topic of identity and identity awareness within one project and be really strict about it, and then improve in the way that you start monitoring different signals and start to automate more and more. And then, of course, it's culture and information security management is kind of coupled to it, and you need to improve together. Some key takeaways. So zero trust, the claim, and there's much in it, is never trust, always verify. Then it's everything around having to deal with identities and really know the standards there, and things like step-up authentication and multi-factor authentication means really having strong identity proof. That is very important. Build apps and deploy apps in a way as if they would be public. So really think of the microsegments. It's not a one-time project, it's a process. It's something that you need to establish in your IT organization or in the complete company. Don't stop, keep up. It's a process. And there are a lot of experts around, a lot of tools around. So to get started, it's helpful to get experts on board. And if you're done right, there are a lot of improvements. I think a lot we covered, but to summarize maybe the 4 important ones. Of course, you have a huge increase in your security and reduce your risk. This is business critical. But on the other hand, it's not just the fear and being more secure. It also comes with increased usability. Think of single sign-ons instead of having to remember multiple passwords and dealing into your company network with VPN. So there's really an increased usability and convenience on many aspects if you're doing it right. It also simplifies the compliance management a lot. If you look at typical compliance requirements, you can have a lot of them can be checked as done if you're doing right with a zero trust architecture, and it simplifies onboarding, offboarding, and things like this. And at the end, that gives you or gives the company that is doing good there a competitive advance that is really important for the future. Yeah. Thank you for listening. I think we have 5 minutes for questions. Yeah, any questions? Yeah, thank you.
PAM and step-up authentication, how they are related, if they are related at all?
PAM?
Yeah, privileged access management. I hope PAM.
Ah, okay. Yeah, yeah.
And step-up authentication, how these two correlate? Do they correlate at all?
I think with privileged access should by default have a very high level of assurance that this identity is the identity. So in most of the situations I know, like administrators or developers with access, with privileged access, they always have a second factor by default. So of course there you can apply step up, saying there's a very, very critical thing that you need to do in your infrastructure, and then you need to provide a third or fourth factor. But I think per default you should have a multi-factor authentication for every privileged access, because the name says it's already a privileged access. Yeah, the step-up authentication use case typically is more for customer or employer, not standard employee related, where you want to have the trade-off between a good usability, not always be forced to provide a second factor, but still having the possibility for really critical actions to re-authenticate. So that is, I think, the use case. Yeah. Yeah. I repeat the question, and maybe you can answer. So I think the question was, how does firewall maybe evolve in terms of handling identities? Which role firewalls play in the complete zero trust architecture? Yeah,
I would say it depends on the segmentation. So if you have like if you're seeing like only the microservice as your segment, or a group of microservices that are covering a specific use case, then you usually put a network around them, have some kind of like a gateway, and also maybe on, if we're talking on AWS, for example, then you have the VPC and put the network firewall in front of that, so that you can make sure that every request that passes, can pass. But I would say it depends on the segment size.
Is it here? No. Other questions? And I was searching that one. I think firewall is more related to the larger segment, but I also expect that firewalls have more and more features regarding level 7 checks and maybe even checking identities. But on that picture, I would say firewall is more the high-level segmentation of your network. Yeah. There's dynamic application security scanning tools. Have any recommendations?
Not really. I mean, I would say like GitLab has some good products that you can use already, that are available on their enterprise offer. So they have a whole security center there, but nothing other special, to be honest.
Dealt with continuous adaptive trust as in reducing the trust level upwards. You presented the step up, so the opposite direction. If something not necessarily suspicious, but the user does something that is not expected, reducing the trust level, and then later down the line requiring the step up again. Have you dealt with something like that, and where would you position it?
it sounds like you have experience with it, so maybe you can probably add your thoughts on it. But I would position it more on the monitoring part to really monitor like what signals you have, and then maybe even revoking access. I mean, that's also a benefit you have with the IAM solutions. You can kill all the sessions, and then the user's locked out or immediately from everything. So that's maybe something that you can do if you've. And then I think the complexity is detecting that suspicious behavior, and I think that's more in the domain of security monitoring. Yeah. And if you have thoughts, you know, we can share it. It sounds like it. Okay.
Yeah, I would say it's more on a level of monitoring anomaly, bad actors on the network and so on. And then I would say if you detect something like this, then you should, close down the account anyways. Yeah.
What is maybe in scope of IAM solutions, and they are adding more and more features, is a context-specific authentication. So if they detect that the user logs in from a device or from a location that is not normally for that user, then the user needs to provide a second factor. That is then kind of rule-based authentication that IAM solutions can do. So that is also part of So the question is, just to repeat the question, where we would recommend, or where we see where to start with zero trust architecture. Is it just in production or already in development? Like this was the question. Yeah.
I would say very early. So also the users needs to be authenticated against GitLab or the host actually, and then they should be allowed to trigger maybe CI/CD pipelines or things like that. I mean, at this point, you already have the chance for supply chain attacks. So I would say really early, but also for every environment. I would not just say like, use zero trust for production. It's also important because you have usually the same code base on every step where users where hackers can hook in.
Yeah, I can only double this. I think it's really bad practice to have some security features that are in development and staging are turned off and then just put on in production. Really, I think from working on the code, developers should think about how to secure the API and need to deal with the tokens that also supports the shift left approach. So very early, solve the problems very early in the process. And yeah, there are challenges in how do I do integration tests, how to authenticate there, but they are all solved. So the earlier you start in the process, the better. Yeah. Yeah. I think we are over time. If you have more questions, you can come to the booth or come here. Thanks for listening.